Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's my privilege to have as my guests Dr. Christina Edmondson and Chad Brennan. They're co-authors of the InterVarsity Press book, Faithful Antiracism, Moving Past Talk to Systemic Change. They take us on a deep dive into the critical issues of racial justice and injustice, especially as we see it in church and in society, as well as what it looks like for followers of Jesus to be faithful anti-racists. And we'll get into definitions and how to think about these things. You're going to find this conversation really helpful, regardless of what part of the United States you live in, whether you're in an urban area or a rural area, whether you are a white person or a person of color. We approach this topic from a variety of angles, and Christina and Chad are incredibly well-versed and helpful. Before we jump into the conversation, let me remind all of you, if you're interested in centering prayer or contemplative spiritual practices, I have a variety of resources that are available to you free of charge. You can check out my website, brianrussellphd.com, for links to all of my resources. If you're interested in particular in centering prayer and getting a practice started and getting updates from me about free centering prayer workshop gatherings, you can sign up at centeringprayerbook.com. Now let's jump into my conversation with Chad and Christina about their book, Faithful Antiracism. Welcome, Chad and Christina, to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. It's so great to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having us.
It's great to be here.
Well, thank you again. And just to jump in, can you both share some key moments in your life and spiritual journey, and I guess we should say it briefly, that led to your public work on racial justice in general, and then the writing of Faithful Antiracism in particular?
Christina, you want to go?
I was like, go, Chad, go. I will start. So, yeah, so I mean, I talk about this in the book. Chad and I both do in the introduction, talk a little about our own stories, our own journey to this book, our journey to this topic. And yeah, I was raised in what would be considered, predominantly black city, and primarily educated in predominantly African American schools, even up through college. Went to historically black college and university. And my parents worked very hard to, I think, in many ways, try to shield me from racism and bigotry. But I don't think even the most well-meaning and intentional black parents can do that. And so, on a personal level, despite what felt like the homogeneity of my cultural context, I still experience expressions of racism. But I believe I had my loving family and church and communities kind of interpretive tools and navigational tools, so to speak, as a kid and a young adult. In college, I studied eventually. I always say eventually because college students, you start off in one place and then you end up somewhere else. But I eventually ended up studying sociology with an emphasis in race, class, and gender. So I find people fascinating. I just think that we are interesting and complex and complicated. And then after that, I went into two different graduate programs over a series of several years. One was a Master's of Science in Family Systems. Again, people are interesting and are interested in their families. And then eventually a PhD in counseling psychology, where I did a lot of work around trauma, not only sexual trauma, military trauma, et cetera, but also cultural trauma. And so the work that I did as a clinician, so the therapy room, the classroom, and then even in around kind of boardroom tables, kind of put all those things into conversation. And the story of race, the reality of race, I think it's always in the room, and particularly in the American context, the United States context. And so I think it was something that we always had to approach, to deal with, to think about, to think through. And ultimately, it became more central overtly in my work. And then had to develop skills to talk about it in conversation with my faith tradition and other people's that are Christian, their faith traditions, in order to be able, I think, to do my job well some days. And so that background, I think, led up to my part in the book.
Thank you.
Yeah, for my story, as I share in the book, I really started off kind of ignoring issues of race in many ways. When I was growing up, I grew up in a strong Christian family, but we didn't really talk about issues like race very much. And I would describe now, looking back in hindsight, my views as a combination of colorblindness, kind of trying to ignore a person's race, and offense avoidance, trying to not say the wrong thing to anyone, and then kind of indifference. Honestly, it wasn't on my radar. I wasn't really motivated. There's been thousands of things, as you would probably imagine, between then and now that have me in this space. But a couple of things that are really big. One was when I was a junior in college, through some really neat, I think, very providential circumstances, I ended up on a short-term trip over spring break. And one of the focuses I wasn't even aware of when I went on the trip was the idea of racial justice and racial dynamics in the United States. And the leaders, talked about their experiences of racism in the United States and systemic injustice. And I remember still just being like, wow, racism still exists. Like that was kind of a revelation for me, in the 90s. And so that was kind of a bit of a beginning, and then a lot of different experiences. My wife and I lived in New York City for 5 years. That's really where I began to have my eyes open to, one, the need for Christians of all races to engage on this topic, how little I knew about it, and then also just the pain, the division, the dysfunction that is in U.S. Christianity around this topic. And so I was a part of a large evangelistic ministry, and it just always kind of felt, like it wasn't handled correctly or biblically, and it was just kind of navigating all that. It just seemed so strange. Another thing that was really helpful and informative to me is I earning a Master's of Theological Studies through Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I really appreciated the fact that they, in our coursework, really emphasized the Bible's emphasis on justice. Mm-hmm. I'm thankful for that theological frame. It was things that I was kind of exploring. I did that through a 10-year process as I was in the middle of doing ministry. But it was just super informative to me to have professors that were like naming those things, and people that I could respect. I knew the Bible very well. And it just was not something that I experienced. I honestly cannot think of one sermon, until when I was in my 20s, that was ever focused on like justice, let alone systemic injustice. And so that was super helpful. So long story short, it's been about 16, 17 years now or so that I've been working in this space. And so there's been lots of really cool confirmations, challenges all along the way, but that's been my story.
And thank you. And again, the Chad and Christina's book is called Faithful Antiracism, Moving Past Talk to Systemic Change, out now from InterVarsity Press. And before we get into the actual deep content and talk about racism and anti-racism, I think it's just interesting. I love having authors on, and I have two co-authors. And can you both just share just briefly what it was like to write a book with another person? If you have any tips for people that are thinking about co-authoring, and again, as we joked before, that's without throwing pies at each other in the process here, of course, but because of course it was a wonderful process all the way through. Any tips for authors? Yeah, thank you.
I think so. I think there are certain personality types that probably lend themselves to co-authorship more than others. Let's just say that. And I think that not only did we write this book together, we wrote it during a fair amount of transition and COVID and life. It's just a lot going on. It was, for me, it's been really great working with Chad. I think that when we first started to brainstorm the book, and he approached me with, do you want to do something around this topic together? I was appreciative of the invitation to participate and to think through this topic well. I think that certainly, particularly white majority culture people need to be listening to the voices of people of color. But I also think that white people need to be talking about race from their vantage point, because they have a vantage point and a narrative and a story as well. And so I actually like the idea of writing the book together. So not even just the technical elements of how we did it, but I appreciated what it would mean for a Black woman and a white man to write this book together on this topic. And I do know of other books that have been written in some different ways. I don't know of any book off the top of my head that quite has that combination though. And I thought that would be interesting in a lot of ways. I don't know. I'm curious to hear what Chad will say, but I think our process was go to your corner and create what you create. And then bring it back and see if it's cogent, and like keep doing that multiple times. And then one of the things that I think that Chad was able to do was to take this pantry of stuff that we created through our Zoom calls, but also we did have some in-person like large brainstorming sessions, like conceptual sessions, and to then like put it together like a jigsaw puzzle. So, that's how I think about that experience, and then obviously trying to bring to bear our areas of expertise. And so, prayer is incredibly central to, I think, all believers, but certainly to who I am, and processing questions and psychology. And so I got to do my thing as it relates to that in the book as well. And it's very multidisciplinary. So we were able, I think, to bring to bear all the things that we've been talking about for well over a decade in our independent work, but kind of merge those things together. But I'm curious, Chad, how would you describe the writing process?
It was fantastic. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I think I was obviously thrilled when Christina said yes to work on this project together. I knew her great work. And so over the last 20 years, I've seen so many blind spots in my own life that I've learned to just avoid doing anything solo as much as possible. Like that, doing things collaborative is a very, very high value for me. And everything that we do, training, assessment, anything like that. So I knew from the beginning I had no interest in writing a book on my own. So it was thrilled when Christina said yes. One thing I would say that I think was a really big moment for us, just in terms of development of the book content, was, we both had, all kinds of experience and things that we were passionate about. And so we originally went down the path of, you write a chapter, I'll write a chapter, you write a chapter, I'll write a chapter. So we kind of, we had these, like what Christina was saying, we had kind of all these units of things that we wanted to express. And so fortunately, I'm so thankful that we had the time with IVP, and both just in time. Even COVID, I think, gave us a little bit more space, for it to process. So we weren't like facing some kind of like, you got to get us the manuscript in 3 months kind of deadline. So we actually had a year to let it sit. And so what we did over the process of that year is we took the 2-voice approach and merged it into a single voice. Mm-hmm. And so the majority of the book is written as a single voice, with occasional moments where we speak from our personal experiences. And I was happy with how that turned out. I feel like it was much more of less of just like a little bit of me, a little bit of Christina, and it was more like us. And in that process of just taking our individual content and perspectives and hashing that out together I thought it was really fun and helpful.
Yeah, I love that. And thanks for sharing, because that's kind of what I was curious about, because I do know people have done books and they usually split stuff up, and you can almost see the change in tone. And this book reads pretty seamless. And so that sounds exactly. So I think it's really, it's really remarkable. And and I think it's a great model, because it is obviously, it's almost like you have dual editors and stuff before you even give it to the editors. So you're able to really get a really excellent polished product. So, so congratulations to both of you. And now let's get into the real meat today, but thanks for sharing that. And again, I feel like every question I'm going to ask you could just be talked about for hours endlessly. So the first question, and every one of them, is probably massively unfair at some level. So I'll just say that. But I'm guessing since you're the experts, it'll be a little easier than it would be if you were asking me these questions. But just on some definitions, because the whole conversation gets so polarized in the context of United States politics now, and let alone even within the church. So when we talk about words like, I'm just going to pick two of them, which I think are really, I think are central. If there's others, please define some other words too. And by the way, they have a great glossary in the back of the book that does little short definitions of a lot of the key terminologies that runs through Faithful Antiracism. But like, what does racial justice mean? And then what is anti-racism? And then if you can frame that in some ways, since these are words that get used not just among Christians, but among non-Christians and people of different political agendas and such. So, and how is the Christian approach to this the same, and also how would it be different from what you might see in a big business setting, or but between a political party or even just some ideologically driven movement that's would be essentially outside the church? And again, I know that's a big question, but I'd love to hear how you would answer those questions.
Yeah, you know what? I'll pick up the one around faithful anti-racism. You didn't ask about faithful
No,
anti-racism,
that's true too.
anti-racism, but
Yeah, yeah,
I'm gonna answer both of those,
it's
Brian.
good.
And then Chad, why don't you pick up the second term around racial justice? And so I'll just tell you the story about how we named the book. So the book is named Faithful Anti-Racism on purpose. And when we're thinking about faithful, I mean, this gives a direct nod to your question about what makes it uniquely Christian. And I'll start with kind of a theological framework of common grace, that like this world belongs to God. So we have the ability to decipher across disciplines. Sometimes Christians will kind of tag Christian on like a shoe company or a school or a book or whatever. But all of God's creation, we are invited to explore, discern, understand, etc. And hopefully learn more about God through God's creation as well. And so we didn't want to just take some concepts and say like let's just attach Christian to it. We really wanted to interrogate them and also use the scriptures, or sit with the scriptures, to see the way in which scripture informs our social ethic and our understanding of racial stratification, and how humans treat humans, and how groups treat other groups of humans. And so faithful has to do with a nod directly to the faith tradition. So full of faith, dependency on God. It's God's world. We're trying to appeal to and understand God's ethics, not our own. When human beings try to rank each other, we get it woefully low, as history bears witness to this. And so we want to be informed by our faith tradition and a deep dependency on the Holy Spirit and Scripture. Additionally, we think about faithful as the way that we do something. So kind of persistent, not perfect, but persistent, steadfast, committed, day by day. Racism, as we know it, and we'll talk more about that, is we make the case, and I don't think it's hard to make it, even though people may not like it, that it's kind of baked in. It's at the roots of this tree. And so it's been there for a really, really long time. So in order for us to resist, we're going to have to resist faithfully, day by day, intentionally, right? So that's the disposition that we invite people into. When we talk about anti-racism, I know maybe around the last decade or so, that term has become like pop culture, mainstream. People, they hear that. But anti-racism, as we think about it, goes all the way back to the earliest abolitionist work. So as long as we've had race-based chattel slavery, as long as we've had the idea of racial stratification and the ranking of humans for the purpose of financial exploitation and gain, we have had people who have resisted it, and largely they have resisted it because of their faith in Jesus. Now, with that being said, there were people who participated by the droves in human stratification who would have claimed the name of Christ as well. But the abolitionist movement is where we're really drawing from this contemporary expression of anti-racism. And that abolitionist movement was undergirded by people of deep, deep faith. And so racism, race-based discrimination, for the purpose of subjugation of some and domination of others, usually for economic gain or also identity purposes, right? A sense of self, is something that anti-racists don't just say like, well, that's not who I am, I'm not racist. They actually resist it because it's baked in. Kind of the more contemporary tagline is that you would have to resist it, that it wouldn't be good enough to just say, I'm not a racist. Well, it's kind of baked into, the air that we breathe. It's the water that we're drinking. So the disposition then is to actively resist it in our own hearts, but also in policies and practices, et cetera. So long answer, but that is
That's
how we
good.
decided to define the book, and that's how we think about it as it relates to our faith as well as the historical tradition of anti-racism.
No, I appreciate that. I think that's really helpful. And by the way, I don't have a bunch of questions about the biblical and theological foundations, but we'll say to everybody listening, if you read Faithful Antiracism, there's lots of that in the book. And one of the things I really appreciated is you draw a lot off of the book of Acts, which is just, I think that's just a wonderful place that connects a lot of the stuff that obviously was happening in the early church and the trajectories. And so if anybody does pick up the book, they give a lot of the backstory to racism in the United States and the laws and things, but you also get all the way back and you get real substantive biblical and theological foundations, which is going to be so helpful to get the word out in believing communities. So thank you, Christina.
Thank you so much, Brian. Like that part about making sure that what we say is rooted in scripture and that we're handling God's word thoughtfully and carefully. We love when people who are in that work are like, you did a good job. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing I can speak to in terms of how is it different than secular efforts in this space, I think they really can have a complementary relationship. So when I first started working this space about 25 years ago or so, I noticed, and even personally, the focus was on relationships. Have a friend of another color, or have a friend of another in another race, or whatever it may be. And so it was a big part of that is a minimization of race as systemic injustice in the racial hierarchy, that Christine was talking about. And so oftentimes, as we both work extensively with Christians on this space, even just to get Christians to a place, particularly white Christians, I should say, to a place where there's an acknowledgement of the racial hierarchy in the United States is oftentimes a really big challenge, right? So that's I think maybe the blind side of the church, generally speaking, particularly among white Christians. I think on the side of the secular side of this work, I think there's also sometimes a blind side of the need for the relational too. I think it can be really heavily focused on the systemic and policies and those kind of things, and kind of minimize the need to have those deep relationships to inform those kind of structural systemic policy changes that are essential. And then obviously the huge component that we try and stress over and over in the book is that this is way more complex. And there are way too many forces that push against this work for us to do it in any human strength, either individually or collectively. So I don't care how smart you are, or how great of a nonprofit you have, or how good your legislation is, or what kind of dynamic leader you are. At the end of the day, I don't think it's going to dent this monster of racial injustice that just continues to just wreak havoc on our country and the church. And so I think ultimately, if we want to kill that monster, then the only person that can do that is Christ. And so I think that's our conviction. And so that's where, we'd love to collaborate, work with secular organizations in various ways. But I think one thing that I think there's always a limitation in that, because if we're operating under two very different assumptions about what is necessary to produce true both integration, equity, and justice in the United States, that's where I think the roads diverge.
Good, thank you. And is racism, is it mostly just a white problem? How do you all talk about something like that? And I don't mean that to make that a loaded question, but just curious, how do you all talk about that?
Yeah, when you said that, it made me think of the late author Toni Morrison, and her kind of challenging and eloquent pushback about her books, and why don't you, which typically, right, her books focused on the experiences and lives of Black people, specifically Black women, and she would get a lot of questions about, why don't you write books for white people? Why don't your books don't have more white characters? And she famously says in an interview to the white male interviewer, what are you going to do about racism? It's what are you going to do about it? So I think in the sense that so racism is a problem for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely a problem, certainly for our souls, because sin is a problem. It's a huge, huge problem. And it does not remit with time. It cannot be wished away. And so it's a problem for all of us, in the sense that there's a unique, I think, there's a unique need for people who identify as white to wrestle with race and racism. I think that's true. I think that's true. I think that would be the group that we know, even from the research, that's most likely to quote unquote not get it, or to embrace the full realities, burdens, and even history of racism. So in that sense, yes, it is a problem for white people to embrace, to see, to recognize, and for white Christians to call on the Spirit for wisdom and courage in which to dismantle racism. But racism impacts everyone, everyone, all people. And there's a way in which not just racism, but white supremacy, I would say, not white people, but the idea, this notion, this principality, this philosophy of white supremacy has misshaped the ways in which many groups see themselves. So the dynamics between Asian Americans and African Americans is informed and shaped by racism and notions of white supremacy and racial hierarchy, even though, even in that example that I just gave, there's not a white person in that scenario. But certainly those ideas about who has value and what it means to have value in the society are still very much impacting the ways in which non-white people groups interrelate even with each other, and certainly also with people who identify as white.
Okay, thank you. And so, like, just in this, just to follow up on that, because I mean, there's no challenge on what you just said, because I think that's it's just self-evidently true. But like, because if we're talking about the United States, that's clearly the right answer, or Europe. But is the issue ultimately, it could just be power, right? So like, if I'm in China and we're writing a book about Chinese racism, that's not necessarily caused by white people in the United States. That's their own ideologies, and they clamp down on certain groups within their own country. So it's kind of like whatever the dominant culture is potentially can do the most harm via racism. Is that safe? And I'm not looking to try to do any kind of
No. I think that's a great opportunity. So one I would say is that white supremacy, as we know it in the context of the West, certainly has been exported all over the world.
Yeah.
But to your larger point, that what comes first, the chicken or the egg. So greed and self-idolatry and thinking that we're God over our neighbor, that certainly comes first. And racism then becomes one of those means in which to exercise domination, maintain control, and maybe even to have a sense of our own very fragile identity. So I think that, to your point, Brian, or I think what I felt like you were leaning into, is that no, the ultimate issue is really in kind of greed and domination of other human beings. Racism becomes a really savvy way in which to do that has been in place for hundreds of years, and is very damaging, but also very profitable.
Yeah. And then, so, I'd love to, there's all kinds of parts of the book I'd like to talk about, but one of the chapters I really did appreciate was the one where you talk about magic thinking, which is just really interesting, because you read through it and I'm like, oh, geez, all the typical things that I would say that, and again, I don't try to prove that I'm not a racist or whatever, but, you can you just run through a whole list. Like I have a whole bunch of, all the little cliches that most people say, and you have them all listed there. And then you also, to be, fair and balanced, you also talk about wokeism being a magic thinking kind of a thing too. Or so in a sense, you can almost say it's certain kinds of virtue signaling that I'm not a racist is really magical thinking. But talk about some of the misconceptions that really aren't the misconceptions that we make about how maybe we're not racist, how that actually the things that we think aren't as helpful as perhaps on the surface you might think they would be. So just talk a little bit about magical thinking and some of the blind spots that creates for us.
One thing I think it's important we don't really talk about in the book very much is to think about why those things are chosen and valued by people. And I think from a big picture standpoint, I think it is helpful to recognize that those are oftentimes options that are less costly than the more sacrificial systemic changes that require more personal investment, both individually and institutionally. So, but yeah, some of the ones, I don't know if there was one that maybe stuck out to you in the book, we could talk about that one, but
I guess the most interesting one for me, and again, you all didn't say this was bad, but it's and I think the key point was the systemic one. But I think the most common one is a lot of people, navigate lots of different friendships with people from different cultures. I think especially like I live in Orlando. My wife is Puerto Rican, and I live in like a Spanish speaking part of Orlando, essentially. And I'm kind of for a long time in my neighborhood, I was like the only white guy that even lived in the neighborhood, and so it's like I could say, hey, I got all kinds of friends. I shop, and so it's that doesn't prove that I don't have racist tendencies in my heart. So I think that was the most interesting one, is that you could have potentially a large variety of friends, in that. It's not that it's bad, and you don't say that, but that isn't necessarily, that isn't the panacea to fix the bigger issues. So I guess maybe you can just talk about that one, because that would be one that would surprise people. It's like, geez, I got all these friends, and that's not good.
Yeah, we talk about a related concept in the book that I think is important, that kind of fits in there, called moral licensing. So obviously relationships are incredibly helpful. I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't have, many people that were very gracious with me, and great friendships that opened my eyes. So it's a huge, huge, huge helpful thing. But unfortunately, what oftentimes happens is if people have cross-racial relationships, they may think, well, I can't be racist because of X, Y, Z. And that could be, friendships, that could be marriage, that could be adopting cross-racially, that could be I attended a multiracial school when I was growing up, fill in the blank. And so they actually studied this. Social scientists have studied this, that, when you do something that you feel like is ethical or good, then you can be more likely to do things that aren't, and kind of justify that to yourself. And so we see that pretty frequently as well. So yeah, I think again, it's, if you think about, again, the function of these things, like it is sadly, oftentimes I can speak personally, and then also we observe this, is that desire to have the cross-racial friendship. I think if we're really honest with ourselves, it's more about us, and kind of proving I'm not a racist person because, see, I have a Black friend. So it's kind of our, way of saying like, hey, I'm on the good guy side, kind of thing. But is it really, we're really going in that to be learners, and to sit underneath their leadership, and to tackle the things that I might be doing that are contributing to the systems that disadvantage them on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think that's good. So so thank you. And again, I'm looking at the clock here, so I want to make sure I get to some of the more some other questions. But I think that was an enlightening chapter in the book on the magic thinking, and the things that on the surface there's nothing wrong with them, but they're not as good as and predictor, and they're not useful for solving the bigger systemic problem as you might hope they would be, at least. So just to get more down into the weeds now. So when you read your book, the thing that, and I knew this before I read your book. I mean, it's like, if you want to know kind of, profile for what a racist is going to be, you can just look for, in some cases, it's the Christian church sometimes comes off as more homophobic and race, and anti-Black, anti-immigration. You get, and your book runs through with all these statistics, which can be depressing at some profound level. But you all work with local churches. You're both Christians, and so you still believe in the church, and you believe in God's people. So when you move into what are some basic strategies? Like, if there's pastors that are listening, it's like, what would just be some basic strategies that you have found in general? And again, there's no magic bullet here either, but what are just some things that can help local churches to understand the dynamics, especially of structural racism, and then make some substantive changes so that they can become allies and part of the actual solution to this problem in ways that glorify God ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, the doctrine of the Catholicity of the church. So this sense that Christ is drawn to Christ's self a people from every tribe, nation, and tongue, and we have a diverse cloud of witnesses to God's grace. I think there's something in that, obviously, that speaks to the fact that Jesus is not a tribal deity, or for one group of people. He's not, the the God of kind of nationalistic America, but this is the God of the world. And that's also, I think, a reminder to us to listen to learn from, to serve amongst, and to be submissive to other believers who have experiences of God different than our own, and certainly experiences of society as well different than our own. So I think there is such richness in the story of the church that is broad and diverse, both nationally in the States, but just throughout the world and historically. The other thing I would say too is that churches, um, you know, so Christians, we make some really bold claims. We really do. We make claims about about who God is. We make claims about who we are to God. I mean, these are big claims that people who are outside the faith are like, what are those people talking about? And I think that our credibility, well, scripture talks about it. Our credibility rests in our love for each other. That's like the biggest apologetic that we
Yeah.
have been left with. And what has gotten in the way of that is, even from the earlier church, when we talk about Acts, is that we have taken the so-called kind of ways of the world, domination, um, and longing for power, prestige, etc. So, kind of Pharaoh scarcity mentality. Like these Hebrews are growing big in number and they're going to overtake us. So let's work them even harder. We have sometimes inculcated that mentality, and
Mhm.
that has caused us not to give the due love that to each other, and that has deeply impacted our witness as the people who say we are the people of God. So I would say that people have to see this issue. Christians have to see this issue at the heart of our apologetic, as at the heart of our witness that we have been changed by the thrice holy God. And then also, we need to be trustworthy to society. So we cannot live in mythology. We have to actually read history. And because we are the people of hope, right? That's kind of our brand too. That we are the people where hope is clinging to us, and that we're prisoners of hope. Then we can actually talk truthfully about just how jacked up things are, right? We don't have to pretend that things are better than they are when they're not. And so Christians, and I think local churches, need to understand history. And I would say start with the history of where they're located, but also the history of their particular theological tradition, of their local church, of its relationship to different groups of people, to immigrant stories, to people of color. And so we need to know that history, because there's enough grace for us to tell the truth.
It's good. Do you want to add anything, Chad, or I can ask another question? Or
I think Christina was hitting on it. One thing I would say, just kind of simple, practical, would be know yourself,
it's good.
know your organization, and know society. So I think there's a breakdown on all three of those levels with a lot of the Christians we work with. They don't really have a good self-awareness of where they are on these issues. They kind of feel like, oh, I'm not a racist person, but they don't really understand their own implicit bias. They don't understand how they're unintentionally perpetuating racial injustice in their own life, in their organization. We do a lot of climate research, Christian universities, Christian organizations, and consistently over and over and over and over again, I'm in board meetings or with leadership teams of organizations, and their perception, they come in thinking like, oh, we're doing pretty good in this space, and then we'll do research, and we'll see there's this huge disconnect. So that's a big deal. And then oftentimes, part of our national research has just consistently revealed that Christians, white Christians in particular, tend to have a much less accurate view of racial dynamics in our society, and also a much lower motivation to address racial injustice. And so there's kind of a breakdown at all three of those levels.
That's so good, and thank you for those answers. And yeah, and and it's just fun that, I mean, you read the Bible, and the Bible has no problem pointing out everything that Israel did wrong in their entire history as you go through the Old Testament, let alone if Paul and Peter fighting with each other, and you do use that as an illustration of speaking to one another. And so you have these great biblical models, which we don't always think about when get defensive about talking about the United States, when the United States is, just a country that's been good for many people, but that it's not a perfect country, and it doesn't have to be perfect, and it can be it could be better in 50 years than it is today, which presumably we
That's right.
all hope it is.
That's right.
So talk a little bit, again, a good piece of the audience here would be pastors in probably smaller churches that aren't in suburban areas or even in urban areas. And so they're more out in rural parts of the United States. And, and again, I would never deny that there's not any diversity in rural areas, but in some rural areas, depending on what part of the country you live, it can really almost be just completely homogeneous in some sense. And I mean, there's always a few persons here, but how do you help people do this work when there's not a lot of demographic diversity where they are? And even like, some of the solutions, which is to build like a diverse staff. Would you recommend, if you're essentially in some rural not isolated, but rural place where there's literally not a lot of people of color, would you still recommend a church hire a person of color to come out and live and be one of the, literally one of the few persons of color in an area? Just wonder how you would think about that, and how might you help, again, pastors in really, again, I don't want to just pick on red states, but I mean, out in the conservative areas that tend to have problems with racism. I mean, explicit and obvious problems with racism. How do they address that when a lot of times their problem is they don't actually know anybody that isn't their own race, essentially?
Mm-mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really helpful question. So one of the things I often share with people when I'm training, particularly in the context of the United States, it would be different if we were talking maybe about some other parts of the world. But in the United States, I would say that homogeneity is maintained. So the reason why, our communities look the way they do, whether that's redlining in an urban context
Yeah.
or sundown laws in a rural context about who can come in and not come in.
Can you explain the sundown law? Because it's funny. I'm 53, and I was just speaking with an African American pastor up in Illinois, and he was talking about he was still afraid. I'm like, I don't even know what that is. So I'm guessing other people don't know what that means either. So what's
Yeah. So sundown laws are a product of the post-Reconstruction, so late 1800s, and Jim Crow era of the United States, in which we have kind of overt segregation. So like segregated water fountains and schools and all those things, and churches, sadly to say. But we also had practices in which people of color, Black people specifically, and also other groups were told in some clear ways, sometimes implicitly but explicitly, like written written on a sign, like, do not come into this space after sundown. And that's not only in the Deep South. There are parts of the Midwest that also have a similar story and similar legacy as well. So when I make that point about homogeneity is maintained, I would say to my brothers and sisters in Christ, my siblings in Christ who are in rural churches that are predominantly white, to give some thought to why their community is homogenous today. What is the story of why it continues to look the way that it looks today? And then what we have learned from sociologists like Dr. Corey Edwards and others is that our goal isn't just diversity for diversity's sake. We don't want to have kind of a phenotypical tokenism where we're like, come on out here, we feel good about ourselves because now we have a Latina who is our preacher, or we have a Black person who sings our music, or whatever it might be, especially when we're putting them potentially in a community in which they will not have a sense of ethnic affinity, ethnic community. Our goal isn't diversity for diversity's sake, it's equity.
Mm.
The goal is equity and honoring kind of our intrinsic human dignity. And from there we see amazing things happening. If you look at the book of Acts and we think about some of the oldest kind of baptismal creed from Galatians 3:28, what it means to be baptized, as someone is saying there's neither Greek nor Jew, or male or female, slave or free, and like that, slave or enslaver, right? Those are sociological categories that are in some ways reinformed by our spiritual designation, our spiritual identities. So that bold, divine expression of equity used to be a part of what believers would hear as they experience the water of baptism, right? And I would say that those theological reminders, both baptism, the communion table, which also have sociological implications, I would be thinking about how to preach and teach and highlighting those dynamics, but also sharing with that rural community to have them to do their own kind of historical study about why our community, why our neighborhood, why our town looks the way that it is. How has this homogeneity been maintained?
Good, thank you. I promised to wrap this conversation up. Do you all have a couple extra minutes? Do you want me to try to wrap us up in 5 minutes? Keep going. Okay. All right. Cool. Thank you very much. Because this is fascinating. So, like now for persons of color who may be listening, I mean, I have I think I have some of a diverse audience. Like, what's anti-racism look like if you've actually in a group that's been a victim of racism? Like, what's the role that, say, a Latino or Latina church can play, or an African American congregation, or Haitian or Korean, or whatever the group might be? What role does a person of color, an ethnic congregation, play in this whole conversation about anti-racism?
I was like, Chad, go ahead and start. I know you're pausing because you're like, I am not going to start as the white guy. I feel like I'm reading your mind. So this is what I would say to that. So again, we're all breathing in the same air, drinking from the same fountains, and so the ways in which the lies about what groups are, closer to God than others. I know that sounds like really on the nose, but that is a part of some theological traditions.
It's true. Yeah.
And that has had a grievous effect on people of color, even if they are in kind of an affinity space where it's only people of their racial or ethnic background. And so I would say there's still a need to interrogate the ways in which people have internalized racial inferiority, the ways in which they have internalized, lies or belief systems of white supremacy, anti-blackness, anti-indigenous realities. I would say that many groups, non-white groups, still have those struggles. And as you get into the book, you'll see the ways in which Christians of color also can function in a way, very much so in their thinking and practice, that denies the reality of racism, even for their own group or for others, other people of color. So I still think there's great work that can be done. I also, as when I think about the history and legacy of the historic Black church in America, particularly National Baptist, the AMBs, the Progressive Baptist Church, the Kojics, I think about the ways in which these are largely homogenous African American churches, but have produced prophetic witnesses, not only for the good of Black people, which would be perfectly fine because they're Black people, but also for the good of society, for people who are poor and marginalized and unseen and immigrants, etc. And so I think that there is a beautiful and robust theological tradition there that all of us, whether we are African American or not, but because we are believers, we can learn from and be guided by. So that's how I would begin, I think, Brian, to answer that question.
Thank you. And just to deepen that just a little bit out of curiosity. So, given the fact that well, you just mentioned the Black church in the United States, that created a robust, safe place for a community. So, if racism would literally end, is the goal? Let me ask this in two different ways. Is the goal to essentially always have multi-ethnic churches? And then in that case, you'd be losing the discrete witness of these historic groups that were marginalized. And the other way would be, as a white person, if I want to be in a multi-ethnic church, instead of, getting a bunch of white church planners and then inviting, persons of color to come to the church, would it be better for white people basically to say, hey, I want to go join, I'm Methodist, so let's say instead of being United Methodist, I become African Methodist Episcopal or something like that? Like, what are your thoughts on, those two kind of ideas? Like, what's if we were thinking about a telos for this?
Speak to that a little bit. So I think one of the important things to first reflect on is the fact that there is a lot of dysfunction in terms of how, exactly like you're pointing out. So many times when particularly white Christians think about diversity or unity or reconciliation or those kind of things. Typically, even though it isn't conscious in their minds, what they're picturing is that persons of color coming into predominantly white spaces and assimilating or code switching or basically just doing things in a white way. So, and that may be tough even for some people to listen to even hear language like doing things in a white way. Like, we don't do things in a white way. We just do things, so, and I understand that with my background. That was definitely part of my journey, is to try to, well, what does it mean to do something in a white way? But our white cultural practices, or what's normative to us or preferred, is in everything that we do. It's in how we worship. It's in how we disciple. It's in how long our services are. It's in how far when we talk to someone, how far are we apart? How loud is our wording? All these things. How direct are we in our communication? All those type of things. That's all cultural. And so, first of all, I think just acknowledging the fact that there is a white culture and that is very strong in these spaces is super important, so that we don't assume neutrality, that we're inviting people in. And so that is, like Christina mentioned, Dr. Corey Edwards has done a great job of pointing out the fact that the damage that results when we just invite people of color into predominant white spaces without an acknowledgement. She uses the term white invisibility, or with some of her language, and that's just super important. But I think you're kind of raising an excellent point that I hope that all Christians would wrestle with. Well, what does a truly unified, loving, integrated, 1 Corinthians 12 type church look like in the United States in light of 400 years of racial injustice? I love that question. I hope that if we are informed by the true racial realities in our country and led by the Holy Spirit, like we see in the book of Acts, I think we could see some really powerful, amazing things. But I think it would involve exactly what you pointed out there, which is more leadership sharing. I think oftentimes our dysfunction really is that lack of power sharing, and that lack of leadership sharing is at the core of our dysfunction and our inability to do that well. And so that's really what I'm hoping and praying for the future of the church.
Good. It's interesting. I tried to think about the whole country is divided on everything, and when I think of this question, I don't just think I wasn't particularly thinking about racism, but I think it would work as like one of the questions I like to ask my students is who does a person have to be or become as a precondition to hearing the gospel from you and your community of faith? And I think that actually, again, that's kind of esoteric sounding, but I think that gets at that whole business about forcing somebody to code shift, or, from a racial perspective, or what did you just say? White normal? What was the word? White?
But white normativity is one that's used.
Yeah. No, but you just used the word too, is about just not recognizing the whiteness of the piece. What was that phrase?
Transparency.
Well, yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's really interesting. Let me just ask one last big question. And this is probably the most unfair question that I have, because it's like, if you solve this problem, you could probably be elected yourselves or whatever. But, one of the things, yeah, exactly. No, well, see, we need people that don't want to be elected to be elected. That's probably would actually solve a lot of problems right there. But sorry. Yeah, you just got out of dean. You don't want to be an elected official on top after being a dean, for sure, right? So, but given the fact that one of the issues that's really is going to solve things is we have to solve some things at the policy level, whether it's local, state level, or even federal stuff. And one of the you give out lots of recommendations, but one of them is to vote for candidates that would support racial justice, and then that instantly just brings us into the whole can of worm of just partisan politics, which is so difficult to solve real problems, at least the way the parties are today. So I was just wondering, given the fact that probably have Democrats, Republicans, and I'm just going to say conservative and progressives. I don't know what the fairest label is for any of these things is anymore, listening. And you're thinking, well, geez, I don't want to vote for the other party just because, or one way or the other. So like, what have you seen anything? Well, like, what would be something positive that you see about racism from, say, both a conservative or a progressive? And we're just talking about generics, and this can even be classical period if it's not and we're not looking for name modern figures necessarily. Like, what did the two sides get right? And obviously, what are the blind spots of both if we were going to find the ideal person that could really lead us really well on these issues?
Wow, that's a question, Brian.
Yeah, I want to find out who I should vote for, right? So it's like, because it's hard to vote
Oh,
for, yeah, because it's just it's such a
well, see,
difficult thing to know who to vote for anymore.
well, that's what Christian discernment was for. I was speaking somewhere recently, and people were talking about kind of their just obviously all the angst and conniptions about like who can you possibly vote for. And typically, when people are having that conversation out loud, I think they're probably referring to like the large national election, like the
Yeah,
presidential.
yeah,
They're not thinking about their local level. And I would stress to people, if you're getting kind of discombobulated, right, or anxious about the national election, then you need to get serious about your local elections
it's good.
and to think about kind of school board. There are so many types of ways in which politics, not partisanship, but politics are at work in the way that we think about who has value, who has voice, who has resources. And so if I get why the national elections would make you a little nauseous, but get really involved in what's happening on the local level, because that's where God has placed you, and you have a call to neighborliness. And so be neighborly as it relates to politics on your local level. The other thing I would say is, and I don't want to completely dodge your question, Brian, about what good things they have done. I will say this. I would say that racism and white supremacy um, are such monsters, such principalities, that they have a way of co-opting all the, I mean, both political, we think about political parties and the other smaller parties as well, right? And I think our goal then is to, I think it's where we can learn a few things from people who I think about my ancestors who risked their lives for the right to vote, and certainly women who risked their lives for the right to vote, and um, and they were voting for really bad candidates. I want you to think about what it means to study for a really long time, to take a test in order to get the right to vote that none of the other white people had to take, and then your choices are racist and racist. I mean, like those are your options.
Right.
And what I would say to Christians is the reason why we have spirit empowered discernment is not to help us to make obvious choices. Like clearly there's an angel and there's Satan. These are obvious choices, right? We have spiritual discernment because we need to be able to navigate difficult, complicated choices.
It's good.
We need discernment in order to do that. And I think what I tend to go back to is I start to think about the quartet of the vulnerable. So the sojourner, the widow, the fatherless, the poor, and the way in which from they are throughout the entire canon. Um, our eyes are drawn to them because God's eyes are drawn to that population, those populations over and over and over again. So I'm thinking about those types of those ethics, regardless of who the candidate is on a local or national level. I'm just trying to get closer and closer to honoring and centering the quartet of the vulnerable. I tend to think as an educator that when you center or you teach to a particular space, a place, it ends up, if you're teaching to the right place, it ends up impacting everybody in the space. And likewise, I think if you center the quartet of the vulnerable, that it becomes a blessing for everyone, even though some may feel like they're losing things. Well, so I didn't answer your question directly, but hopefully I offered a bit of kind of ethics and perspective around that. Chad, I'm curious, how would you answer that question?
I think you did a fantastic job. One thing I would point out at that point is that in the book we talk about the danger of package deal ethics, and I think regardless of what political party you're in or groups you're following, there's always this danger to take on their ethics rather than biblical ethics. And there, in the book we talk about, some parties might focus on these four things, another party might focus on these four things. Well, meanwhile, there's a whole other set of things that are not talked about by either. And so, and maybe things that are even contrary to what the Bible teaches that both adopt and say, well, these are the things if you're going to be in our tribe, in our club, you have to be, really excited about these things. So I think we need to be discerning. We need to find that third way. We need to not be co-opted by any political party or group and really be seeking the Lord, to Christina's point. And one thing I do want to touch, just because it relates to power and politics and everything right now, because the season we're in, I think, is really unique. And so what you see throughout American history is, especially around periods of time when white dominance is challenged, you see there's a really oftentimes a strong backlash by white individuals, and that often takes the form of economics, politics, and religion. And typically it's very difficult to even discern which is which, because those three things are so tightly intertwined and feeding on each other. And so I think we are in one of those seasons right now. Another season that was similar was like after the freeing of the slaves. So that during that period, white individuals in the United States, it was like, oh, we have immigrants coming in here, and we have freed slaves, and Mexican Americans, and it was just, it was like, oh my goodness, what does this mean? Well, you see this, this resurgence of violence. That's where we see thousands of lynchings. We see all of these, black codes. We see all of these things, and political alliances formed between Christians and racist groups like the KKK, and all that happened. And part of that was the maintenance of white power in the United States. And I think that we are in a stage right now in the United States where something similar is happening right now. So there's a lot of questions about changing demographics and what does this mean for me and my family and our neighborhood. And I think it's fear-driven that there's alliances that are being made in ways that are contrary to the scripture, that are damaging to our society, and they're damaging to the church in themselves. They don't realize it. And so we do touch on, like, Christian nationalism is a really big deal right now in the United States. And I think that one of the ways to think about Christian nationalism is it's a willingness to kind of fudge your true Christian convictions for the sake of political power. So where you can really tell that you're a Christian nationalist is when there's an issue that the Bible says this and your group says this and you go this way. Well, then you probably are struggling with Christian nationalism. And so I think that is, there's some great books that are out right now that delve more deeply into what that looks like. But I think as Christians in the United States, white Christians in particular, we always have this temptation to align ourselves with kind of these evil groups with these anti-Christian agendas for the sake of political power. So if we're willing to just fudge a little and do some of these things, well, then now we can have the people we want in the White House or in the Senate or whatever it may be. And it is an incredibly dangerous, dishonoring, dysfunctional bargain that in the long run will only hurt ourselves, the church, and our country.
That's a good word, and that's obviously that paints things well. And I appreciated both of your answers on that very much, because I'm always interested on policy, because that's why I didn't want to say Democrat and Republican, because there's still two parties and they're still two different. Like, I always think, in a sense, the left needs the right needs the left, because you need to have different kind of policies and have real rigorous debate around things. And the thing I loved, I think, Christina, because people do, you can naturally gravitate to a political party. And I always think to myself, I just want more Christians and all the political parties that are solid believers in Jesus. And if you just have that preferential treatment of the poor that comes out of scripture, because there's different policy solutions to that could solve things, and you need to have those conversations. So thank you for, I didn't know how we do with that question. So that was actually fun. So I appreciate you all both taking the time to share that. And again, I want to be fair. I'm going to skip one of my questions, but I'm curious about some books outside the Bible that have really shaped you deeply. And you can answer that question, whether the books are about racial justice or even just Christian books that have shaped you as followers of Jesus. I'd be curious what your kind of 2 or 3 books that you both have, or either that each of you have found personally helpful to you. And that's the impossible question, obviously, too. That's the hardest question of all right there. So
it's okay. No worries, Brian. I've given myself permission to not name all the books. It's interesting. One of the first books that came to mind as you were talking is a book called Kindred by Octavia Butler, who is an African American woman who was a science fiction writer as well. And so I really like sci-fi, and I also really like history. And in that work, she kind of tells the story of a Black woman who goes back in time during the time of enslavement. So she's in the contemporary culture, but she goes back in time. And that was one of, I think, the required freshman year books for my undergraduate institution. So every freshman had to read, first year student now known as, had to read that text together and discuss it. And so I like the nod to history and the way we think about multi-generational consequences of racism and racial trauma, as someone who's is a psychologist now. But I also like the liberty of the writer, for this Black woman to write about sci-fi, to dream, to imagine, and to put that in conversation with her own cultural identity and heritage. So that book comes to mind to me because I think it holds hands with many different things that I think are interesting, including the idea of Black liberation socially, but also Black liberation individually, that this Black woman can dream up this world, that she can work within the system and genre of science fiction as well. And as someone who was 17 and when I started college, that was a wonderful thing for me to read and to embrace and think about the power and beauty of dreaming.
Cool.
Well, one of the classics that has really helped inform and challenge me is Bonhoeffer in a number of spaces, both his PhD work and his look at the confessing church. Sadly, I think it's incredibly relevant today. If we look at even the growth of Nazism and the Third Reich and what he was up against in terms of his own version of German Christian nationalism that he faced at the time, and the complicity of the church and the willingness to water down their faith convictions for the sake of aligning themselves for political power. So that's been very informative. I've also really enjoyed the writing of Christopher Wright. He's a British theologian, and he, about as well as anyone, I feel like really makes just a fantastic case for using the Old Testament as a basis for ethics in a principled way. So we obviously can't adopt, word for word the teachings of the Mosaic Law, but to capture what is really going on there in the social system that God created for the people of Israel, and how can we replicate the principles of that in our society today. I love his writings on that. I think it's super helpful and really practical.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and Christopher Wright's one of my favorite writers. A lot of my students listen to this, so they've read his book. So he's been very influential in my life and in my teaching. And yeah, he does have a great perspective. And so, yeah, thank you for sharing those resources. And just the last question is, if listeners want to reach out and connect with you, where are the best places to find you online? Where if folks want to get some more information?
Yeah, so Twitter, I'm out there. I sometimes bravely go into Twitter, and then sometimes I leave for a significant amount of time.
Amen.
Because Twitter is the virtual Wild Wild West, by the way. So, but yeah, you could find me there. And I also have a website, www.ChristinaEdmondson.com. So you can look that up as well. I'm a co-host of a podcast called Truth's Table, which has been around for a few years.
I can share a little bit about how to get connected, a way for Reconnect. So we're doing a really fun project right now called the Racial Justice and Unity Center that we've been working on for a couple of years. So you can learn all about that and connect with me at rjuc.org. A major part of that project is we're developing assessment tools for individuals and organizations. And then I'm really excited about this piece, is we're forming a coaching network of really experienced, knowledgeable leaders around the country that work in this space. And so trying to make it as easy as possible for Christians who are saying, oh, that sounds good, but I need help. I need people who know what they're doing. So we're thrilled to be able to connect them with these individuals all over the country. So love to talk to anyone through that.
No, it's good. And I don't know if we just lost Christina. I think she'd almost finished saying what she was going to say. And so I'll have to go back and see if I need to edit a little bit. But I'm going to pretend like she's still here for a second. We'll see if she comes back on. But I want to thank you, Chad, and Christina for this important work. I also appreciate you patiently answering all the questions that I have and giving us so much time. I think this is a really valuable conversation. And I think, again, your book, Faithful Antiracism, will show it for those on video. Moving past talk to systemic change, excellent resource, highly recommend it. And again, thank you, Chad and Christina for being here today.
Our pleasure. Thanks a bunch. I appreciate the work you're doing too. I actually had a chance to listen to one of your podcasts recently on spiritual development, and I found it both really encouraging and challenging. So it's great work, great important work. So I was like, wow, I need to apply that and that and that. Yeah, it's really, really good stuff. So thanks for the work you're doing too.
Well, thank you. And everyone that's listening all the way here to the end, we're grateful that you've joined us. And until next time, let us live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope in the world. Amen. Listening to this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. If you found this episode helpful, would you consider leaving a review wherever you found the podcast? And if you're interested in any of the resources mentioned, please check out the show notes. If I can be of any service to you, reach out to me at deepdivespirituality@gmail.com.